Thanks for being part of this podcast today. This is Gary Zacharias. You're listening to the Apologist Bookshelf. I've already done, I think it was one previous podcast on a book by Andrew Walker. It's called God and the Transgender Debate, subtitled, What Does the Bible Actually Say About Gender Identity? And I feel bad. There was so much in one of these chapters that I'm looking at my notes, and I think I only did half the chapter. And so what I'd like to do, if that's okay, is go back and kind of rehash in sort of an abbreviated format the part that I did do before in an earlier podcast, and then finish up the chapter. So this is chapter 6, called Beauty and Brokenness. And basically, throughout the story, the author, Walker, retells the story in Genesis of Adam and Eve. And so he picks up now in chapter 6 with the fall. Satan offers Eve a pathway of her own choosing. She's promised pleasure and enlightenment. Choice is a big deal for humans. We love choice. And so the serpent comes along and he says, God's rule, that's not very fair. It's petty. It's restrictive. I mean, this is what the serpent says. God knows when you eat of it, your eyes will be open. You'll be like God. Oh, that sounds pretty good. So she says, all right, that's what my feelings are telling me. How could it be wrong when that tree and that fruit look good and delightful and seem so wise? And Walker says, isn't our story too? We don't cast our decisions to reject what God says as the action of rebels. We don't see ourselves as rebels. We're masters of ourselves. What's wrong with that? Doing what we think is right in our own eyes. So it's casting off of God's rule in Genesis 3 that has brought the disaster to us. And he says Eve's choice was the choice of an alternative lordship. Really good point, I think. So he's saying that what happened there so long ago and in such a dim, distant place, but what happened in that garden made its way down to all of us. Why should we judge Adam and Eve? Each day we do the same thing. We sit on our throne. We want our life to run our way, and we tell God, take off, I'll take care of myself, thanks so much. And we're all sinful. And unfortunately, if you look back at Genesis, what happened? They knew they were naked after rejecting God, and the first result was that people felt awkward about their bodies. And they said that's not the only time that's ever happened. And then they move on. Walker says the rebellion also affected all of creation. Again, that's Genesis 3, if you take a look at 17 to 19, those verses. Creation is broken. We break. We have cancer. We've got depression. We've got eating orders, and gender dysphoria. And all of these shows that the entire creation has been broken. So we have to realize, we have to remember that this world is not how it was intended to be. We need to understand the effects of the fall. It's not only outside of us when we look around, but it's within us too. And Walker says inside every heart, there's a war going on. There's a battle between the heart. It's our conscience and waging war with these desires. We have bitterness, anger, envy, greed. Our hearts aren't pure. Jeremiah 17:9, I go back to that verse a lot. The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it? Boy, that's just so opposite from what we're hearing today. Trust yourself. You do you. Follow your heart. Well, that's not what the Bible says, and I think if you've lived any amount of time at all, you think about your own heart, and you're honest, and you say, yeah, that's me. The heart is deceitful. We convince ourselves that we'll be happy. We'll have real joy if we just indulge what our hearts desire. And the author says, well, not every impulse we experience should be indulged, right? Listening to our hearts can get us in trouble. I mean, prisons are full of people. They acted according to their feelings. And he says the real question is this: which desire should be fed and which should be starved? So he gets back to gender dysphoria. He said those people do have real, honest feelings of distress. And he said nobody should dismiss this. But here's the problem. Experiencing that feeling doesn't mean that feeding it and acting on it is the right thing to do. If you have an internal longing for peace, it doesn't mean finding peace is going to happen through breaking the boundaries of our limitations. People who undergo sex reassignment surgery, they're desperate for a change. They're desperate to get rid of that distress. But the people who undergo sex reassignment surgery don't statistically report higher levels of happiness afterwards. Yeah. So the Bible has been telling us that if we embrace a desire that's at odds with the Creator's design, we're not going to have happiness. And then he points out that gender dysphoria by itself is not sinful. There's a distinction between experiencing a feeling and acting on it. See, I think that's really a super good point. So people who experience gender dysphoria are not sinning when these experiences occur. The Bible never categorizes unwanted sexual distress as sinful, the author says, but deciding to let that feeling rule is sinful. You're deciding that your feelings are going to have authority over you. That's going to be the ultimate authority, not God, but your feelings. So Walker, I think, makes an excellent point there. And he says, when our hearts get hardened, we've decided, hey, we're not going to have God as the controller of my life, our minds are affected too. Our reason gets impaired. We can think brilliantly, he says, but not necessarily truthfully. So he said our minds matter in this whole transgender situation because it's the mind that processes the experience of people who feel that gender dysphoria. If you like, he says our minds tell our hearts whether our feelings are reasonable. But we can't be sure whether our mind's reasoning is valid. Yeah, I think that's right. Okay, so we're getting close to where we were at the end of that last blog. So he said, deciding that the only reasonable course of action is to affirm every feeling about self-identity that someone has is a blind alley that leads to absurdity. Just because they feel a certain way, we shouldn't be affirming that. He says, would that be kind to tell somebody who has anorexia that, your self-perception of being overweight is right, so keep on that diet? Well, no, people die. Would it be kind, he says, to tell somebody who feels that life isn't worth living that they should act on what their heart and head are saying? No, we don't want them to die. That would be cruel, not kind. So just because somebody feels a certain way, we don't want to reinforce it if it's going to lead them to worse problems. So now I'm on the new section of this chapter. He said, between birth and death, he said, our bodies don't work the way they should. Boy, do I know that as I get older. So he says, watch out for that argument. Hey, I was born this way, right? A lot of people want to end the discussion by saying that. Hey, that's the end, right? I was born this way. He says, well, a lot of us have characteristics we've always had, but we wish we could change. Or people tell us we should change. We are all born that way. But here's the problem. We're born that way in broken bodies. People are born with all kinds of predispositions that don't produce joy and wholeness. So we've got to decide, when we say I was born that way, we have to take that word way and decide, I was born that way. Is that good? Is it a positive way? Should we affirm this? Should we embrace it? Or is that way that we were born, is that a negative one that we should reject it or treat it? For example, if I'm born toward a predisposition toward aggression, would we want people to say, well, that's good, go for it, you were born that way, there's nothing you can do about it? No. And he says the same thing is true for people who experience gender dysphoria. Said some people say they've come up with what they call the brain sex theory that says individuals who have gender dysphoria have a brain structure that mimics the one of the opposite sex. But he says evidence is inconclusive on this. It's just a hypothesis. But he says our bodies are broken. So how should we think, he says, about gender fluidity? The feeling, as he said before, is not sinful, but is broken, and acting on your dysphoria is sinful. So he said God hasn't given up on his creation, and he doesn't want us ripping up his blueprint. I think that's a good way of putting it. So he says when Adam and Eve grasped at being gods instead of human beings, they wanted to be their creator rather than creatures, God didn't allow them to have what they wanted in full. He says we can grasp at being men instead of women or genderless instead of gendered, but God doesn't allow it. We're unable to do it. He says we can change our form, but we can't change our formatting. He said in truth, there's really no such thing as transgender. You can't change your gender. And he quotes Paul McHugh. Now, Paul McHugh is an interesting person. He's an esteemed psychiatrist. He was the University Distinguished Professor of Psychiatry at Johns Hopkins Medical School. He was the former psychiatrist in chief at Johns Hopkins. And here's what he had to say. Transgendered men do not become women, nor do transgendered women become men. All become feminized men or masculinized women, counterfeits, or impersonators of the sex with which they identify. In fact, he says this, gender dysphoria, right? That's the term that you feel like you're really belonging to the opposite sex. He says that's in the family of similarly disordered assumptions about the body, like anorexia. He said its treatment should not be directed at the body. He said the treatment should strive to correct the false, problematic nature of the assumption and to resolve the psychosocial conflicts provoking it. So he says you don't fix the body. You don't try to fix the body. You got to fix the mind. That's where the problem is. He quotes also, now back to Walker, he quotes from an author, Tony Reinke. He said, chromosomes can't be re-engineered, removed, or scrubbed from the software of our bodies. He says it might be possible for a trans woman to pass for a woman on the street, but it's not possible for a man to morph himself into a biological woman with all the experiences and functions of natural femaleness. Okay, see, I think that's an excellent point that he's making there. He says a trans woman can grow his hair long and wear high heels and pump estrogen into his body, and a trans man can cut his hair short and force testosterone into her body. He says what you're doing is pushing against the body's internal software. He says this is a bleak picture of humanity. He said we are marked and we're marred by sin. And he said it's really hard if you're thinking about a loved one who's got gender dysphoria, but it's hard for all of us, he says, to read because we all suffer from living in this fallen world, and we all contribute to its fallenness. We all sin. There are 3 words that we all need to hear more than once. We all sin. So he says to transition is a sin, but, he said, it's not the sin. It's no worse than lust, adultery, envy, greed, and all those other sins that middle-aged heterosexual guys try to explain away or excuse themselves for. Wow, good sentence, huh? So, yeah, that's a sin, but so are all those things that people try to excuse themselves for doing. He said, we all coerce ourselves in a direction that runs against nature each time we try to take over God's throne and use it for ourselves. Yeah, exactly right. We are rebels, and we're trying to do things ourselves. So he said people who feel morally superior or self-righteous at the sins of others, including those on the transgender path, says you're feeding a feeling that wars against their own soul no less than the person who would like to be a member of the opposite sex. After all, Jesus' strongest words, Walker says, were reserved for people who defined themselves by comparing themselves favorably with others. Remember how often he goes after the Pharisees? He talks about them being whitewashed tombs. They're terrible on the inside, but they look good on the outside. These Pharisees felt that their own goodness was enough to earn them approval from God. And of course, Jesus, he was so harsh on them. He was far less harsh on the ones who were the prostitutes and the cheaters and things like that, because they knew they were broken. Well, he ends the chapter with a good feeling here. I mean, it's been pretty grim, hasn't it? He said, we're in a beautiful world, but it's broken. And it's filled with humans who can do some wonderful things. Oh, and we can do some terrible things. We can reach great heights, but we're fundamentally flawed. He says our hearts, our minds, and our bodies are beautiful things, but they are broken. They have been since Adam and Eve first decided they'd be better rulers of this creation than its creator. But, he says, there is hope buried in brokenness. And he takes us back to Genesis 3. He said, in that chapter where humanity had just fallen into this abyss of sin and brokenness, God announces a hint of what's to come. So I wanted to read that. It's really short. It's Genesis 3, verses 14 and 15. The Lord God said to the serpent, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. So God promises to send somebody, right? He, right? Somebody's going to come and is going to bruise somebody's head, and you'll bruise his heel. Well, that's the first message, the first hint that God has figured out a way, and he will get us out of this mess that we've put ourselves in by bringing the Messiah into the world. Okay, so that's the book, God and the Transgender Debate. I hope you appreciate and can understand why I like this book, because it's loving. It's very kind. It's not harsh. And it's practical. So this would be a really wonderful book if you're dealing with this in your family, or you're just curious to know more about gender issues. We're seeing it story after story. So Walker in this book explores what it means to be male and female, and he suggests how we can think through the various views on gender. He spends a lot of time looking at what Jesus said. Jesus loved people. And he also talks about what Jesus said and why it's good news for everyone. Everyone. So he says if you want to learn, this is on the back cover, it says if you want to learn more and love better and are open to considering what God has to say about sex and gender, this hope-filled book is for you. And I agree with that. It's an excellent book. Again, it's called God and the Transgender Debate. Well, thank you for being part of this podcast today. Take care.